Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid Exam Skills, and today we're going to look at the 5-mark reliability questions which are found on the depth study part of the exam paper. Now, before we begin, we should have a little disclaimer. The advice here is not the only way to approach these questions. These are certainly not strictly specified by the exam board. What these are a collection of techniques and tricks and hints that have worked quite well for students in the past. If your teacher gives you different advice, the golden rule is always follow your own teacher's advice, not just some weirdo on the internet. And all the examples given in this video are from the specimen exam papers and the example answers found on the OCR Ancient History GCSE website. So as always, let's look at where you can find this particular question. Again, as always, find the right depth study. Make sure it is the section that you've been taught rather than one of the other two. There are 3 depth study sections, remember. If we look there on the screen, it follows immediately after the question about what can we learn from the passage. So again, this is the second question about that passage. This is what we're going to look at. Again, as always, very sorry, but the examples we're going to look at are from Alexander the Great and Cleopatra and Rome, because these are the units I teach and these are the ones I'm comfortable with. But the techniques that apply to these 2 studies will equally apply to any depth study that we find on the GCSE paper. So before we look at some examples, let's quickly have a look at what does the question want and what doesn't it want, more importantly. The key thing with this question is to focus on the extract. It does say how reliable is that extract, not the entirety of whichever historian's work you're looking at. If you're not linking your answer directly to the extract, realistically, you can't get more than a couple of marks because you're not actually addressing the source. So the question is, how reliable or how accurate do we think this is? There are a few key things we can look for. One thing that's always a dead giveaway in these kind of questions is to look for specific phrases. Do remember, ancient historians love to give their opinions, whether it's based in fact or whether it is just their thoughts. So anything where they kind of doubt the nature of their sources or they throw in their opinion, you can instantly pick up on that and use that as the start of any analysis. With this in mind, again, look at who wrote the extract. You should, coming into these exam papers, know these authors, these historians, really quite well. And you should ideally have a solid bank somewhere of strengths and weaknesses, good points and bad points about each author. Again, you've got to use the source, but you can use this knowledge to explain or develop your answer. So whilst your answer should be based primarily on what is written in front of you, do use your contextual knowledge of the writers, but do it to help explain. Don't make this one of your key arguments necessarily. The other thing to bear in mind as well, when it asks how reliable, it's very easy just to say it's all bad, it's negative, the ancient historians were pretty bad at what they did. You shouldn't necessarily do that. Look for the strengths as well. If nothing else, if you're really stuck, do remember you're studying these historians for a reason. These are the better ones. So you can always throw that in when you're looking at your context. And last but not least, key point, it's only 5 marks. Don't go mad. We're not looking at a lengthy analysis of whether this author is reliable or not, or whether they're a biographer, or whether they favour the Julio-Claudians, or whether they are just a military historian. We're not interested in that. 5 marks, get in there, try and make 3 good points and move on. So here's our example from the Alexander the Great paper. I've left the previous question on as well. Here's the extract. So again, the question here is using details from passage D. Evaluate how accurate do you think Diodorus's account of this event is. So again, we're back to the source, but you're looking for some kind of key details that you can use to say he both is and is not necessarily the most reliable. So again, here's a highlighted extract for you to look at. Again, if you want to pause the video, have a close look at the screen, do so. I've just gone through and quite quickly highlighted some of the key things that could be used as the basis for an evaluation, a quick evaluation, don't forget, of how accurate we think this is. So I've started by looking particularly at Pausanias, and the point I've picked up here is that Diodorus seems to know what this guy is thinking. He applied his personal anger, so that we see this sense of Diodorus claiming he knows what this person is thinking. We got some quite good details about this plan, positioning horses by the gates in the city, and went to the entrance of the theatre. Again, if this is a secret assassination attempt, we could ask, how does Diodorus know this? Or is this him simply telling a story? I've also highlighted this idea of a Celtic dagger. It seems quite an unusual phrase to use. We could question what Diodorus means by this, or how has he come to this very specific detail. The next bit in the middle, we've got then Pausanias, seeing the king was alone, ran up to him and striking him straight through the ribs, left him dead on the ground. So we've got quite a relatively straightforward description of the event. So we could say, yeah, he's telling the story as it is. And further to that, we've got some, right at the end, we've got some very specific details about who were in the gang of the bodyguards who went out to try and catch Pausanias. So again, we've got this idea of Diodorus is desperately trying to prove that he knows what he's talking about. He's including these little specific facts. So just at a quick glance reading of this, I think you've got plenty of points there without necessarily bringing any contextual knowledge about Diodorus that you could use to evaluate how accurate this thing is. And now to a sample answer. Again, this is a full mark sample answer from OCR. They do offer some commentary on this question. We can see it's relatively brief. It's quite to the point. The point it's making here, however, is that Diodorus is not actually very reliable. If you read this answer quite carefully, which I would suggest you do, pause the video and read it, a lot of this answer is based quite heavily on who Diodorus is, and particularly where he gets his sources, where he gets his information from. One thing that always seems to score very, very highly, and this was definitely the case on the previous specification, was any reference to where the historians gain their information and an understanding of why this is problematic. That is going to score you quite highly. It's much better than just saying, well, he doesn't know, he wasn't there at the time. You can say that about most historians, to be fair. So it's quite clear. It talks about Pausanias' motives. It talks about some of the details of what was happening. It also, at the end, posits an alternative version. Now, this is obviously a very high-level answer. This is a candidate who clearly knows their material inside out. This idea that there's more likely stories that Olympius was behind the murder. That, again, is using specific knowledge of the authors and the story to offer an alternative view. One thing we could point out when looking at this extract is that, given that this is from Diodorus, Diodorus is not one of the main authors we study when looking at Alexander the Great. So the fact that he's a bit of an outlier should hopefully spark some kind of curiosity in how you're answering this. They've chosen this for a reason. But like I said, this is a very context-heavy answer. You could equally get 5 marks by highlighting specific aspects of the source. But this gives you an idea about what we mean by context. And now an example from Cleopatra and Rome. Again, I've left in the previous question because this passage is about the Battle of Actium. The question again, you should be able to see how very similar these questions are. Using details from passage C, evaluate how accurate you think the description of the events in the passage is. So this is quite different. It's asking about the detail of the description rather than something underlying like the relationship. And once again, here is a highlighted copy of the source. Again, pause the video and have a quick read of the things I've highlighted. Now, the good thing with some of these depth studies, most of the depth studies, I'm going to say most, but the two depth studies we're looking at here, Alexander and Cleopatra, one thing you'll find is that the depth studies tend to focus on individuals or certain events, and these are quite controversial events or individuals, and as such, it's almost like the ancient writers can't but help throw in their opinion. And in this extract, you see this source is littered with Paterculus' opinion. So if we're talking about how accurate is the description, the first thing I've highlighted is the fact that they call it the greatest battle. Well, that's a bit of a bold statement. It says Octavian, Caesar and Antony led out their fleets to fight. Again, we're back to this idea of giving details of this was a naval battle rather than a land battle. And then again, we've got this idea of one to save the world, the other to destroy it. Straight away, we can suggest there are problems with the objectivity of the description of this source. Then we get some more positive detail, one side having everything. We know Octavian's forces were significantly better prepared, and the other had nothing but soldiers. We see descriptions of, particularly in this case, Mark Antony, a very unfavourable description, which would suggest there's issues with the reliability of the description of these events. And again, the last bit on the source where, again, we've talked about look for these phrases that writers throw in. He starts with, to be honest. That doesn't necessarily scream objectivity, does it? This is an opinion. And again, we've got this description of Mark Antony being kind of cowardly. And effectively, if we were to read this source just on its own, we'd take that the entire battle was lost because Mark Antony did a runner. And his army wasn't very well prepared. So again, as you can see with this, there's plenty to start hanging your evaluation of, is this reliable or not? And again, to a sample answer from OCR, this one only got 4 out of 5 marks. I know, shocking, they missed a whole mark. But again, it's a good illustration of what we mean by a brief, to the point evaluation. You don't need to go into great detail. It starts by pointing out that, some of the details here are quite accurate. Where you've got multiple sources that cover an event and they match up, it's always a good idea to say, yes, this agrees with what the other sources say about these events. But then we get some of this contextual analysis. They're looking at Paterculus and they're saying he writes in the time of Augustus, didn't want to displease his ruler, which could help explain why Paterculus gives such a glowing view of Octavian, such a dire and negative view of Mark Antony and particularly Cleopatra. Interestingly here, they've been credited with marks, but even though they've missed out the point that Paterculus is not necessarily writing under the rule of Octavian, later Augustus, he certainly did flatter the Julio-Claudians, even though he's writing under Tiberius. At that point, saying nice things about Octavian will have got you some brownie points with the current rulers. So that last statement is not necessarily 100% accurate. Again, what this source could have done to get the 5 marks was again say, look, some of the details match up to other sources. For example, Plutarch, one of the main writers for this particular unit. But what's good about this one particularly is it is offering both positive and negative comments about the reliability. It's using a little extract. It's picked out some of these particular quotes, and it is offering a kind of brief but insightful analysis of whether or not this is particularly accurate. So to sum up these 5-mark reliability questions, key things. 1, focus on the source. The question is about the source. You really need to address it. Admittedly, one of those examples didn't do that in great detail, but examiners have indicated that if you don't focus on the source, you're going to struggle to get the marks. Aim for 3 things. 3 things is always a good number for this. Look for any speculation or historian's opinion in the source. You're likely to find someone somewhere. Don't just look for the negatives. Again, point out that some of the material is going to be reliable where possible. Does it match up to what else you know, to what other sources know? And again, do develop your understanding of the source with what you know about the authors. The key thing, though, is to make sure that that is in support of what's in the source or what you're saying about the source, rather than being its own entire argument, because given the way the mark schemes work, you may come undone if you just start writing about who the author is. So there you have it. There's our quick look at a 5-mark how accurate or how reliable is the source question from the depth study part of the paper. Hopefully this has been useful. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.